We are delighted to be here today. I am Jennifer and I use she, her pronouns.
And I'm RJ.
And we are with the Anti-Stigma Project, and that is part of On Our Own of Maryland. So it looks like you all can hear us okay. We are, here we go. I'm seeing the little note in the chat to everybody, letting you know that if you cannot hear us, please check your own device. Um, We're going to be sharing some information with you today about an issue that impacts, we believe, all of us, whether directly or indirectly, whether in our personal lives or in our professional ones. And that is the stigma around behavioral health. Now, in today's world, oh my gosh, so many folks are anxious and stressed and traumatized, and folks may need support perhaps for the first time. Or maybe they have pre existing mental health or substance use issues and they've been tremendously exacerbated. But regardless, now more than ever, it's really important that the folks who need support are getting the support. And that is not going to happen if we don't address the issue of stigma. Now, while we've been doing this kind of anti stigma work for a very long time, we want to make it clear we are not expecting the issue of stigma to be solved in the next 1 hour and 5 minutes. We realize that the topic is vast, it is very multi layered, and we know the impact that diving deep, as we do in some of our other work, can have. But we've also found that there's tremendous value in just starting the conversation, talking about it in a short form, like today, that it helps to shed light on the issue. And we're hoping that you will hear what might be new and thought-provoking information in a safe and relaxed atmosphere.
Absolutely. So as part of that, one thing that we always want to make sure we're agreeing on is that we have mutual respect for one another, that we are going to be aware of the topic at hand, and that we are going to engage in ways that are constructive. I just realized that I'm cutting myself off at the chin there, so maybe that's a little bit better. There are going to be points in this training, since we have chat, and that's wonderful, where we are going to invite you to respond via the chat box. And you're also welcome to use that for questions, as well as the question and answer function, which I do have open on my screen. So I'll be monitoring that as well. Be aware that because this is a shorter format than our usual workshops, we may not have as much time to go in as much depth as we usually do. But we will do our best to answer all of your questions to the best of our ability and in the shortened format. Now, if you do have a question just for Jennifer or myself, please do feel free to send a direct message or post that as a question using the Q&A function. We may share the question with everyone, but we will not say who raised which question. So just if we feel that it would be valuable for all of us to have a chance to respond to it. So one thing that we've learned in our work is that people often use the same words to mean many different things. Not all groups have the same definition for the term behavioral health. So we want you to understand that when we use it, we mean both mental health and substance use. Depending on an organization's background, location, or funders, many use this term behavioral health to refer purely to mental health. But again, when we say behavioral health, we want to make sure that people know that we're talking about both mental health and substance use. So we're here to talk about stigma. When you hear that word, stigma, what comes to mind? Using the chat, feel free to type as many different answers as you can possibly think of. There's no reason to limit yourself to a single response. You hear the word stigma, your brain says what? Just basic word association. There are no wrong answers. Not clean.
Okay. What else?
Going against social norms.
Mm-hmm.
Sadness.
Harmful.
Unwell.
Mm-hmm.
Those are some wonderful responses. Uneducated. Another great one.
Mm-hmm.
And other.
Ah,
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Systemic oppression. These are some really robust answers. And I want to share
Mm-hmm.
just a couple that we hear very often, and you'll see that some of these are pretty similar. So, what we usually hear, a label or a mark, stereotypes, discrimination, and bias. Prejudgment.
That, you know
And
what, RJ, that's a really interesting one. Prejudgment. We have had folks ask us if reducing stigma means never making any judgments, but we have to make judgments every day, personally and professionally. So we're not saying that making a judgment is a bad thing. But often what we're doing is not making a judgment, it's a prejudgment. It's a judgment that we've made ahead of time, often without the facts, the actual facts in the situation that are really needed to make an accurate judgment.
absolutely. And that brings us to assumption, right? We
Mm.
assume things without the benefit of the facts. Systemic oppression, we see prejudice, perception, how we're seen as other, how sometimes folks who are uneducated can see us, right, without having all the facts. And it's painful, it's disempowering, it's isolating, and it undermines relationships. And when you think about the value and importance of relationships to recovery, whether those are therapeutic relationships or social ones, right? We know that they're vital. So anything that undermines them is going to have significant impacts on recovery. So it's going to be limiting, and it's going to leave folks feeling ostracized, right? Othered.
Now, while we know there are many different official definitions of stigma out there, we wanted to share just this one from the Oxford English Dictionary that kind of gets right to it. A mark of disgrace associated with a particular circumstance, quality, or person. And we know that that stigma comes from a variety of places. Some of them you see here. One of the places is from our culture, whether it's the one we've chosen, such as, our work or our organizational culture, or one we were born into or brought up with, our race, ethnicity, neighborhood, nationality, our faith, family upbringing, geographic. I mean, we all live in the United States. We do in our particular organization. The folks who are attending this may not live in the United States. I can't see, so I don't know whether folks are coming from other places. Every country has its own culture. Within the United States, each state has its own culture. Each county has its own culture. Every city or neighborhood has their own way of doing things. So culture is a huge piece of us in many, many different ways. There are many different kinds of culture. So how does stigma factor into that? Certainly the media can impact how we see things, can influence those prejudgments, those assumptions. For instance, how they may cover suicide. That may influence our understanding or even our language about suicide. Committing suicide versus completing suicide, dying by suicide. We know that that idea of committing suicide is, really brings in a whole criminal intent that is very, very stigmatizing. And we've seen shifts in the media toward reporting that in a much more respectful way. But there are places where that still sets a tone, that still creates some assumptions in the folks who are experiencing that media. You could see it also in the way people are portrayed in TV shows. People who are from certain backgrounds or who have certain issues, are they the ones playing the criminals? Very often, when it comes to behavioral health, they are. And what does that say to the people watching it? Personal experience. Now, this is a really, really big one because it's something that has actually happened. And so our brains say, well, this actually happened. So of course that's the way it is. And very often can then replicate that with every situation that seems similar. So if we have experienced something, for instance, our recovery has been through a 12-step program versus something that medication assisted treatment. What is our viewpoint about what is right? What stigmatizing ideas might we have about another way that was not ours? And finally, training and education. That can be stigmatizing. Things change. They used to teach about the schizophrenogenic mother, that anybody who had schizophrenia, it was their mother's fault. It was once taught that mental health issues were a moral failing, that homosexuality was a diagnosis. So, all kinds of things that were taught to many folks that were incorrect. And sometimes it takes a while for the training and education to catch up. And those ideas in any of these 4 bullet points can impact how those stigmatizing beliefs and attitudes and behaviors start to get fostered.
We also know that people can be stigmatized for a variety of different reasons, right? Now, this list is by no means comprehensive, but it does illustrate just some of the many reasons that people often experience stigma in our society. So things like race, religion, sex, age, physical differences, behavioral health, of course, and more. You may experience stigma based on where you live or your sexual orientation or gender identity, the way that you dress, how you speak, including vocabulary that you choose, or an accent, or even your marital status, right? So today we're just going to be focusing on the one slice of this pie that we call behavioral health. However, it's important to recognize that people often experience stigma for more than one thing at the same time. So most folks are experiencing double, triple, many kinds of stigma happening all at once, making each situation worse, more challenging, compounding and intersecting. So, for example, someone who has both a substance use and a mental health challenge, who is also a woman and a single mother, and is facing housing insecurity, they are going to experience a very unique set of challenges and prejudgments that go along with it. So we may not know everything that's going on in the lives of the people that we're supporting, things that may be significantly impacting their lives, exacerbating stigma, making it worse, and impacting their relationships with us.
So, why is it so important to address this particular piece of the pie, stigma and behavioral health? Well, number one, because it impacts everybody. It's an issue that impacts every single one of us. We are fond of saying, if you have a pulse, then you have stigmatized other people and been stigmatized yourself for something. Think of the pie chart that RJ just showed us. And I've had folks say to me things like, well, I work in this field. Of course I don't do this. Or I have mental health issues myself, or I have a substance use issue myself. So of course I'm not going to stigmatize other people. I know what it's like. But being smart or being a nice person or being on the receiving end of stigma and discrimination doesn't make us immune. No one is exempt because we are human and we didn't grow up in a vacuum. All of those things we just talked about where stigma comes from, impact us. And so we may not intend to do it. We often do it unintentionally. But unfortunately, whether we intend to or not, we can still create harm. So we mentioned a little while ago, one of the places is because of prior experience. Just want to touch on that one more time. It's so difficult because it's so ingrained, because it actually came from our own experience. But if you think about it, if we never have the opportunity or the willingness to challenge whatever that experience was, then it can just stay.
Stigma can have significant and even lethal consequences. So sometimes that harm is created by things that we're taught in institutional policies or in our culture, and those are significant. Imagine the following scenario, and this is an actual real-life event that was shared with us. So imagine a person goes into an emergency room and they're in pain. They're complaining of, quote, a fire in their stomach. Now, it also appears that this person is under the influence of a substance and they are seeing things that aren't physically there in the room. So the examining clinician attributes the pain to a behavioral health issue, calls for a psych consult, and then just leaves. Well, hours later, when the psychiatrist arrived, they also determined that there was a behavioral health issue. But when listening to this person's consistent report of fire in their stomach and taking the time to actually examine them, they identified that person's appendix was about to burst and it required immediate surgery. So in this case, the stigma associated with substance use and mental health challenges led to an absolute loss of credibility and this patient's concerns initially being dismissed. And this could have resulted in very, very different outcomes.
Absolutely. And finally, it is the biggest barrier to recovery from a behavioral health challenge. I want to share a few statistics with you. First of all, according to the most recent data from Mental Health America, almost 50 million Americans are experiencing a mental health challenge, and yet over half are not receiving treatment and services. Over half. Let's take a look at another statistic. According to NIMH, people with mental health challenges typically wait an entire decade to get help after their symptoms first appear. 10 years to get help. And finally, according to the Surgeon General's report on drugs, alcohol, and health, only 11% of folks with substance use disorders are getting the services that they need and that they deserve. Those are some pretty striking statistics. And granted, there are myriad reasons for this, right? There are insurance hurdles, lack of access to resources, lack of resources themselves. But stigma is part of the reason why. It's a big part of the reason why. And if you think about it, why would I want to put myself into a category of people who are scorned, scapegoated, and shunned? Why would I want to willingly join that group if I think that there is any other way around it? Especially if I'm already dealing with stigma because of other reasons. So the pie chart that RJ showed us a little while ago, any of those other reasons. So I am experiencing those. So why am I going to add on one more way to be discriminated against and stigmatized? And so maybe I just keep putting up with the hallucinations or the blackouts or the pain of what I'm going through because I don't want to do that. Another thing we sometimes see is that I've internalized that message. I've internalized that stigma. And maybe I've come to believe that I'm not even worthy of getting help. And so I don't reach out for it or I don't accept it. Or maybe I have my own thoughts about folks who have behavioral health challenges. And I'm thinking, well, I'm not one of those people. God love them, hope they get some help. And I'm not that. I'm not that. And so I've got my own stigmatizing views. So for a lot of reasons, stigma is preventing people from getting that help. Many folks I've spoken with have said dealing with the stigma can actually be worse than dealing with the actual condition itself.
And these conversations consist and they persist, they remain consistent. And I'm struck by this quote by the former Surgeon General. And 2019 may seem like a very long time ago, but this is something that we still are seeing every day, where Surgeon General Jerome Adams called stigma the biggest killer. I think the biggest killer out there is stigma. Stigma keeps people in the shadows. Stigma keeps people from coming forward and getting help. Stigma keeps families from admitting that there is a problem. And we would always say that we also want to think that the person themselves oftentimes will stop from admitting that there's a problem. So we know what stigma is. We know how serious it is. But how might it play out specifically in someone's life? Well, to see what this could look like, we have a little video for you about our friend named Bert.
One in 4 Maryland residents lives with a behavioral health disorder. and also lives with the stigma and discrimination that comes with it.
You have OCD? So what you're saying is that you're mentally ill? Yikes.
Stigma hurts, punishes, and diminishes people. It also creates barriers to employment, housing, relationships.
Says here you have disability income. Look, I'm just not sure this is a good fit. Sorry.
Stigma even harms access to quality medical care.
I see here that you take anti-anxiety medication. Your chest pain is probably just anxiety. There's really no need for tests.
The best way to fight stigma is to see the whole person, not just their diagnosis. To learn how you can refocus and look again, visit www.distortedperceptions.org.
So I realized I was still muted. So watching Bert's interactions, did anything there surprise you? Please feel free to use the chat to respond. So think about the situations that Bert was in. We saw him go to dinner with someone, right? And that person, they labeled him mentally ill after Bert disclosed he had OCD, right? Which implies a lot of unspoken things with that label. This is exactly what happens. Right. We saw him applying for housing. The homeowner's response, the landlord, right? Saying he's not sure that he's a good fit because he has disability income. Right. And just like that story we shared before, and again, that's a completely real story. We saw him seeking medical care, right? The clinician just attributed his physical pain to anxiety just because he saw that he was taking anti-anxiety medication. So here at an international conference on stigma, right, I think we're all pretty aware that these things exist, that these things happen. For a lot of folks, though, this is new information. And unfortunately, it's all too common an experience, if not a surprising one. So how many folks could relate to some of what Bert experienced? Feel free to use a thumbs up, thumbs down reaction, or just type a yes or no in the chat. Thank you so much for sharing. I know I can. I absolutely can. And as we heard earlier, as we saw earlier on that pie chart, we all have some experience of being stigmatized for some reason, everybody, even if it's not related to behavioral health. So I'm going to ask you one more question, and I want you to really think about it. And there's no need to react, chat, or respond. I just want you to ask yourself, could any of you relate to any of the people that Bert interacted with? This is a much harder question to ask, and I will tell you 110% I can. Not only have we all been stigmatized, but we've all stigmatized others at some point, even unintentionally, even if our intentions were good. I know that there are situations that I look back on, and I think, I wish I had known then what I know now, because I would have loved to handle that differently. Or I wish I could have known what the impact of my choices would be rather than my intention. And so even if we are doing a great job in our lives, in our organizations, seeing other people for who they really are by not making prejudgments, we need to keep reminding ourselves that everyone that we interact with might be experiencing that stigma or unseen stigmas in other settings. And that's important to know because that may explain their interactions with us, why they might seem distrustful or even hesitant to open up to us. And when we think about the issue of disclosure, right, the theme of this conference, it really makes me think about loss of credibility that goes along with it. So throughout the years, we've had the opportunity to interview a number of people and ask them this very question. What do other folks have to think about credibility and stigma, and how are these things related? So I want to share with you some of their responses to us.
Stigma damages our credibility, leading to misinterpretation, misdiagnosis, and missed opportunities for help.
So in my work as an attorney, we represent people with psychiatric disabilities. And what we see, the manifestation of stigma is that people fall into one or more categories. Either they're inherently violent, they cannot make decisions for themselves, and or they what they say is not true or is irrelevant.
I didn't really know what it was, but I knew I had a problem. And it happened to be while I was in prison. And I tried to reach out, and not just to the people in prison, you know, caseworkers and social workers, but even to family members and friends outside of the prison. And it seemed like nobody was hearing me. And it started bothering me to the point where I thought that I had to do something to get somebody's attention. And one day I was in my prison cell, and I had to ball some paper up and set it on the corner on the floor, and I lit it. And before I knew it, my cell was engulfed in flames.
There are times that when I would be talking to my therapist, and I'd be talking about, and she would lessen it, or I didn't feel like I was being heard or understood, that I was almost in fear of showing any rage or any anger due to upping the meds or there being something wrong with me, instead of just not being heard.
When people see me and they see that they know that I have depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety disorder, all these things, right away they assume that I would be an angry, crazy Vietnam vet or something like that. And you know, I don't like that. You know, I don't like people assuming that I'm something that I'm not. I've never been a violent person in my life.
Your credibility is already minimal as a young person, and then compoundedly, if you have a mental health issue or anything that already comes with some amount of lack of credibility because of stigma, I was furious that I wasn't taken seriously, that I wasn't looked at like an entire person.
Once you have a label, a diagnosis, I think one of the things that happens is that almost everything that someone thinks about you will tend to refer to that label or that diagnosis. So if you're just having a bad day, but people know that you have a mental health condition, then automatically it's, oh, you must be symptomatic. Oh, you must have stopped taking your medication.
And this person was the head case manager, and he basically said that that they were going to drop me. And when I tried to explain what was going on, he said it sounds like it's all in your head to me. And one of his comments to me was, a lot of times you women, meaning transgender women, will make things up, or it might just all be in your head.
I believe that when I started sharing my spiritual experiences with my therapist and my psychiatrist, it was almost like it was a psychosis. And I felt like it was being broken down in a way that there was something wrong with it.
So she then looks me up and down and says, well, if you're here for treatment, why don't you have any drugs or alcohol in your system? I said, well, you know, if it would, help you, I stopped using a week ago in preparation to come here. I don't know what normally goes on in this facility when people come in the door, but everybody's not alike. So if I'm sitting here and I don't have any substance in my system, then I think perhaps maybe I should be applauded, number one.
Always forget to unmute.
There you go.
There we are. So what can we do about this? Now that we've considered how damaging that stigma can be, what can we do to minimize, counteract, and even prevent that harm? So in our work, we found that most people have never really thought about stigma related to mental health and substance use, even if they are knowledgeable about stigma in other areas. And it tends to be a bit of an eye-opener to think specifically about it in this context. Now, fortunately, we're here at Howard University, virtually or in person, having this conversation, and that's so incredibly important to just raise our awareness, to think more about how stigma pertains to us, our personal lives, and our work. Miguel in the chat, education is the key, mandatory trainings and the like. And it's like you're checking out our slides ahead of time. We'll get there in just a minute. But the first thing that we need to do, right, because before we can go to our employers, go to our organizations and our groups and say, hey, we need to have these mandatory trainings. We really need to, perfect, as Carol says, to see people for who they are, not just our perception, our assumptions, based on how they look, they talk, they smell, etc., right? To be aware that stigma exists, to be aware of, our self-awareness about any stigmatizing beliefs that we may have, or even about how we are stigmatized, right? Do we feel as though any of those traits or assumptions are true about us because people have held them? Do we start to internalize those and make those part of our identity? We need to be aware of how it plays out at work, in our policies, right, in different environments, and of course, in our personal lives. And we want to be aware of the actions that we might take, such as the language that we use and how we communicate. So the actual words that we do say matter. Of course they do. But the way that we say them can have just as much impact, if not more, on the message that is ultimately received. So research shows that, yes, the words themselves can make up as little as 7% of meaning when communicating feelings and attitudes, specifically when it pertains to like and dislike. So if I were to say something like, oh, I love ice cream, okay, the words I use make it sound like I really like ice cream. But to hear me, to see my facial expression, obviously that carries a very different meaning. So the interpretation of a word's meaning can be as low as 7% verbal, so just the words that are chosen, 38% vocal, such as your inflection, 55% visual, the facial expression of the person. And the conclusion was ultimately found that 93% of communicating feelings and attitudes, specifically like and dislike, is nonverbal in nature. So if we aren't considering all of these sources of meaning when we're communicating, we may end up sharing a very different meaning than we intended. And we can't possibly hope to effectively communicate or share ideas. Miscommunication, we know, can contribute to internalized stigma. It can impact help-seeking behavior. It can negatively impact quality of services, and it can continue to foster stigmatizing cultures and attitudes and beliefs.
So if we look at barriers to non-stigmatizing verbal communication, let's take a look at these three. We just picked three. There's lots, but we condensed it into three. One is the language, the words themselves. That's 7% that RJ was referring to. So if my first language is English and that is what I'm comfortable speaking, but the person I'm speaking with, it is not their first language, or perhaps they don't understand it at all, there's obviously a literal impediment to understanding what someone is trying to convey. One of the kind of multi layers of that in terms of behavioral health is making sure that a language barrier isn't perceived as a behavioral health issue. Just because I don't recognize a dialect doesn't mean that it's not one. So if I'm thinking that someone is just they're just babbling, they're talking to something that just is gibberish, that may be on me, that I don't understand that they are speaking a dialect I just don't understand. Another piece of language could be jargon and acronyms. That sometimes becomes its own language, right? And folks get so used to using it that many times we don't recognize when someone else doesn't understand it. If they're not in our field, if they're not in our part of the field, if they're even not in our organization. So what do they mean, and when do we need to explain them? So for like, what's goat? What do you got in the chat? What's goat? If I say goat, what does that mean? Am I just talking about a farm animal? Like, what is that? What if I put a goat emoji on there, or I just put capital GOAT? What does that mean? There you go. there's the emoji. What does that mean to the folks who are here with us right now? What does that mean? Tom Brady, there you go. Okay. Or Meryl Streep. There are folks who are really, really top in their field, greatest of all time. Well, if I don't know that and somebody says, hey, you're a goat, God, am I insulted by that? There was a story that Meryl Streep, somebody said that to her and she was really insulted because she didn't know what the heck it meant. So are we making sure that our language is being understood, particularly if it's something that is very, very serious? What are the words we're using? Are people understanding them? A word like decompensating. If somebody doesn't understand what decompensating means, oh my gosh, then you've really got a big issue. A family member once said to me, somebody told me that my loved one was decompensating. I thought they meant decomposing. I thought they died. I didn't know what decompensating meant. So being very careful about what the language is and is it being received? Do they understand it? Is the language offensive? I mean, slurs, epithets, derogatory terms. I mean, if I feel like language that's being used, I don't want it to include me, or it doesn't include me. So it's very gendered language, language that assumes that everybody being addressed is able-bodied, using things like ladies and gentlemen, where there may be people who are thinking, you have now, I'm not included here. Then I've shut down. If it doesn't include me, or I don't want it to include me, then I've shut down in that process of communication.
We also need to think about our relationship with the person that we're trying to communicate with. Because based on that relationship, the person that they're speaking with, they might feel too intimidated to ask for clarification, or they might feel that they might be judged as unintelligent, right? If I've been stigmatized before and treated like I wasn't capable of understanding, well, maybe I'm not going to ask because I don't want to feel humiliated again. And that could be because it's the same person, or it might be a relationship with a person's uniform, perhaps, whether that's, someone with a badge or someone with a white coat, right? I might feel like, well, if I disclose too much, well, I'll be treated differently. I will be untrusted, right? They'll jump to conclusions based on presumptions they have. And it could even be indicative of a larger cultural issue.
And certainly the situation. What are the circumstances? There are certainly circumstances that impair our ability to communicate effectively, whether that is physical differences with hearing or seeing, or time constraints, or the actual place. I mean, if you look here, the idea of an emergency room. You heard the story that RJ related. Someone in an emergency room who was obviously in distress, they may have been having delusions. They also had an appendix that was about to burst. So how do you, in a situation where there's a tremendous time crunch, and so the folks who are, on the providing of services end of things are trying to communicate, but they are really time pressured. How hard is it to then hear what someone is trying to explain, either because they are speaking in a different way than they are used to, or when you're in a crisis, you're probably not at the top of your game in terms of trying to communicate. And so the situation itself, people may not be conveying information in a way that the people trying to support them can readily understand. Particularly in a situation like an emergency room, any kind of situation where there's a very big time crunch. Jargon comes in even more because you're trying to communicate faster, but it's really easy to have things just cross over where people don't understand it. And if you think about somebody, say, for instance, who has hearing difficulties, in a situation like that, then that situation where it's loud, where it's busy, can create things that just compound the issue even more.
Absolutely. And these things, of course, interrelate as well. So I was just talking about relationships and now talking about physical differences. Every time I talk to my father has hearing aids. And, growing up, there's this social expectation that father's supposed to always be right and supposed to always know what's going on. And so if I'm talking to my dad and he just kind of starts to smile and nod at me, I know he's not hearing me, because he doesn't want to ask me to repeat myself. He's afraid to, what I might think or what that social expectation might carry with it. So beyond the words that we're using themselves, our verbal delivery and nonverbal cues like body language can also be barriers to effective communication. So when we're talking about delivery, we mean things like tone, pitch, rate, and volume. And those things can change the intended meaning of the words that are being used, right? So I used the example before, I really love ice cream, right? If you're that unenthused about it, that tone, that pitch is really going to say something. Or if I said to Jen, this is a great audience, isn't it, Jen? Right? How does that make you feel? What is that saying, right? Or, oh yeah, no, I'm so happy to see you today. We're thinking about the situation. If we just said, sure, yeah, no, I have time to talk. What's going on? Just hurry up. What do we got? Right? So all of these things can have a pretty big impact. And another thing that tends to happen with behavioral health specifically is that there's this assumption that folks may have hearing difficulties or speaking difficulties or difficulty understanding. And so folks will oftentimes speak louder and slower, right? And how would that make you feel if someone was talking to you like that? So the expressions that we use on our face. Could our face be telling someone that they're not worth our time, that we're bored? Is it that maybe what we actually think, or is it that there's a mismatch, right? So we actually have one intention and we're expressing ourselves very differently. When I think about the ways that, we're always taught, like, we'll make eye contact, always look at someone, always smile and things like that. But, is that a genuine expression? Is that a genuine feeling? Or are you presenting something that isn't accurate or something that isn't necessarily appropriate? Our body language, right? Sometimes postures, the way that we're sitting or standing, they could be interpreted either as engaged or inattentive. And it really is going to depend on who it is that you're communicating with, right? So if you're sitting there listening to someone talk and you've got your hand kind of resting under your chin, some folks may look at that and say, oh, I'm very, very engaged. Other folks might think they're bored. They're trying not to fall asleep, right? Are we busy with paperwork or checking a phone? You probably at some point have seen I've been taking little notes, tracking attendees, or if someone's sending me a message, just checking really quick, like talking to my co-host or other folks about technical issues, right? What does that possibly suggest if you see me looking away and seem as though I'm busy with something else? What about eye contact, right? I mentioned eye contact before. For some folks, eye contact, very important. It demonstrates that you're listening, okay? And especially when we're thinking about the issue of internalized stigma, right? When folks start to believe the things that others are saying about them. And if you're supporting someone who has been stigmatized, they see themselves as less than. What impact could it have when someone looks them in the eye and shows them that they actually care about what they're thinking and about what they're feeling? Or think back to that relationship. Let's say that you are the person in the white coat or with the badge, and you're making eye contact. Might that be intimidating? Might that be kind of shutting that person down, right? So every situation is going to be a little bit different. So being aware of stigma and how it potentially plays out, how we are knowingly and unknowingly communicating, that's a first great step.
So, education. I can't remember who said that earlier about how important education was, but absolutely. When you look at the research about how to reduce stigma, you see two major things. And the first one, of course, is education. Now, what do we mean by education? Well, it could be formal education. It could be mandated education. It could be a classroom, webinar, whatever. Could be part of our own continuing education we seek out for ourselves. It could be what's being provided in our organizations. But it could also be informal, right? It can be immersing ourselves in a book about a topic that we think would be useful, or having an informal conversation with someone. That's a tremendous source of education. If somebody says something that is intriguing or provocative or even upsetting to me, and I ask them about that, and we have a conversation about that, that's education. Both of us learn something we didn't know. And that's the third piece, that it's reciprocal, that it's not just one of us educating the other person. We are both learning something. Every time we do a workshop, we learn something from the participants, not just the other way around. So education, hugely important. However, education by itself is not enough. Reading books or watching YouTube videos about cooking does not necessarily make somebody a great cook, right? It hasn't made me a great cook yet, for sure. But there needs to be another piece. And that is something RJ will tell you about in a second.
Well, before we go to there, I do want to take a minute just to kind of unpack language a little bit more, because we need to educate ourselves about the language that we're using too, right? So being aware of the language we're using is very helpful. But it's just as true when it comes to education that we need to continue to learn what's considered to be respectful, disrespectful, preferred, non-preferred, inclusive, non-inclusive, right? Because this conversation is going to always be evolving and adapting. And we need to learn that the impact of our words differs from our intentions when we use them. So beyond disrespectful labels and language that isn't person first, an example that folks often don't think about that often, and usually because it comes from a place of empathy, is when folks will say something like, well, I'm just trying to help someone, or I'm trying to help you, right? But this is kind of connoting, it's suggesting that there's this lack of quality of life for someone with a behavioral health condition. And we've heard so many folks tell us that the one thing that they absolutely positively don't want is to be pitied, to be helped, right? Because they can help themselves, right? They want support, right? And so we want to make sure that that's something that's an ongoing conversation, that we're using language that is going to help our meaning pass. And you can see here a long list of different examples of terms that are disrespectful versus respectful versions. Earlier on, we said, the news is doing a much better job of it now, where folks would say completed or died by suicide, to try to remove that criminality that the word committed tends to carry. Right? Or even folks who are well-meaning that would say, well, this is a person who is suffering from behavioral health challenges, right? Well, we're not suffering from it. We're living with it, right? It's something that we're being treated for, right? I've also heard, and this could go either way. One common conversation that folks will have with us quite often is over usage of the word addict, right? Folks in a 12-step program have said that, if they don't call themselves by that term, by that word, that it would impact their recovery in a negative way, and that they very well could be dead, right? Waking up every day and looking at themselves in the mirror and admitting that truth to themselves and to their group is a very important part of their recovery. But for someone outside of that space, right, to refer to them as just a diminishing label, as one particular facet of who they are, can be extremely disempowering and reductive. So that other part that Jen promised before, the other piece that fits hand in glove with education to reduce stigma is contact, right? So just like Jen said, you can watch all the YouTube videos in the world. It doesn't necessarily make you a better cook. You actually have to get in the kitchen, right? And in this case, what do we mean by that? What do we mean by contact? Well, contact is opportunities to interact with the very folks that we may not understand. And that's more than just looking for them, right? We have to find them. We need to take advantage of them. We need to seek them out. And sometimes we need to create those opportunities, right? Sometimes we need to ask ourselves, who isn't sitting at this table right now? Who is it that we need to be having this conversation with? And that can help us to get to know folks as whole people, not just labels or facts or experiences that we think that we know about them, those presumptions that we have. Right? Seeing beyond roles is also an important way to get to know folks on different levels. If we only know someone in a single context, we might forget that they are an entire human being living an entire life outside the roles that we see them in. Does anyone remember when you were in grade school and you ran into one of your teachers outside of the school for the first time? I remember seeing my art teacher in a Burger King one time, and my little mind was just blown. I, for whatever reason, thought that all of the teachers lived in the school and only ate at the cafeteria. So seeing someone in this new space was really eye-opening. And the same thing is true for anyone who exists in a space, whether that's a physical space or one that we've created socially. To take them out of that space, to see them in a different space and see who that person is, really what you know about them and who they are. Finally, and when it comes to contact, the power of cooperation cannot be stated enough. And I'll even up the ante a little bit here and say that it's more important to collaborate than cooperate, right? Cooperation is we're both working towards the same general goal. Maybe we didn't pick that goal. Maybe we're not directly interacting, but with collaboration, we're negotiating that goal, right? We're deciding where we're going together. And that's going to require us to learn from one another, to educate ourselves in every context and role possible, because that's how we get things done. It's really important not to go into competition, right? Because competition can ultimately it could make stigma worse. It could result in an us and them situation. But at the very least, it's not really creating an opportunity for folks to negotiate space and meaning. So for an example, right, let's say that a rehabilitation program is going to add a safe space or a cafeteria somewhere where, people providing services and receiving services and family members can all go and wait and socialize and get something to eat, have a cup of coffee. And so the organization decides, like, hey, let's get everyone involved. Let's invite everyone here to encourage the staff and the clients to work together to choose the color of the room, the artwork for the room, the furniture in the room, right? Rather than, all right, well, we're going to paint the room green. Here's the paint. Here's the art that I picked out. Now just all put it up, right? They're not working together. They're just working in the same room, right? And so really finding the opportunities to work with one another, not in the roles that are previously established, whether that's service provider, service user, family member, right? But just people in a whole new experience, negotiating a solution and working towards that solution. Getting people involved to improve a space for all of them. In addition to raising awareness and educating ourselves about stigma, our 2 and 3 hour workshops also include brainstorming sessions. And so this allows us to kind of put all of these things into practice in real time. Unfortunately, we don't have the time or capacity to really engage with that here. But we did want to share with you just some of the things that we found, some strategies that can help reduce stigma. By reframing the picture, this is one suggestion that came to us from one of our participants, to reframe the picture, explain stigma in a new context, ideally one the person can relate to, right? We all come to understand the issue and how it relates to what we are all individually seeing and experiencing, especially if those things are different. So here are a few other ideas that our participants have suggested to reduce stigma individually, in our groups and our organizations, and on a community, state, and national level.
So let's take a look at some of the ideas that people had about themselves. And I'll tell you that the 2 things that we hear most often in stigma workshops are, number 1, I didn't realize I did it. I didn't realize that I did this to other people. And also, I didn't realize that it happened to me. I never really thought about it that way, or how much it's impacted me in my relationships. So folks will often say it's so important to understand our own biases about others, understand how it's impacted us, to have grace with ourselves as we combat that, and with other people as they're learning to do it differently. And a really interesting thing that I've heard a lot lately is people realizing that one of the ways to reduce stigma is for them to slow down. And really think for a moment, do I have enough information to make an accurate judgment? Or am I falling into prejudgment because I'm trying to do this so fast? In the words of one person, to prepare for slow change, resistance, and fizzle, whether that is with other people or that's with ourselves.
For group and organizations, we often hear that it's important to bring it up at a staff meeting, right? Raising awareness, putting it on the agenda. Don't just talk about it, actually make it happen. Discuss stigma openly and transparently, make it a common thing. Focus on the purpose or the goals of the conversation rather than the problem or by casting blame. Right? So not, all right, everybody, we're going to talk about stigma today because Frank screwed up, right? But really like, hey, everybody, we want to create a space where everyone feels welcome and everyone feels inclusive. And so we are going to have a conversation, be intentional and consistent, and continue to support those who are in change. And by in change, we mean here, of course, folks who we are trying to get to see, to raise their awareness or to educate.
And in a larger sense, what about the greater community outside of our organizations? Things like participating in awareness events, spreading information about issues and services in our communities, contacting our legislators, letting them know what we think, vote. And all of that kind of gets summed up in that very first bullet point, which is not underestimating the power of our own voices. You never know who is going to hear that message, who is in a place of authority to do something about whatever that specific issue is. We are based right outside of Baltimore, and when the Baltimore Ravens came to town, I know there's at least one football person in the audience who knew who Tom Brady was. They had a very stigmatizing ad campaign. And so several of us wrote letters, not expecting it to do anything. But we figured, we had to fight the good fight and do something. Well, 3 weeks later, I'm sitting in their corporate offices, along with 2 other members of this project, and they pulled the ad campaign, multi-million-dollar ad campaign. So obviously those letters made it to the desk of somebody who was willing to take action. So not underestimating the power of our own voices.
Something someone else brought up, I just want to add this, is follow the funding, Sometimes, yes, our own voices can do incredible and powerful things, but ours aren't the only voices out there. See who's listening, right? And like following the funding, seeing who is supporting what types of change. Try to see what organizations are out there that are trying to raise their own voices. And sometimes lending your voice to an existing cause can be a really productive way to affect change in your community as well.
Mm-hmm.
So the central question in all of this is, are you seeing clearly? Are you seeing clearly as someone's label, right? Are you just seeing someone's label, or are you accepting someone's label about you? Or are you seeing them or yourself as a whole person outside of roles and expectations and prejudgments? And this includes how we see ourselves as well, just as we discussed earlier. So are we seeing others as identical to the last person who we saw, maybe in a similar circumstance, or who had similar things going on in their lives? Maybe we are seeing them clearly. Maybe we are taking the time to make sure that we are accepting all the new information that's coming in, and that's great. But maybe only with people who have depression, or maybe only with people who use alcohol, or maybe only with people who have either of those experiences in ways that we identify with or understand or relate to, right? Maybe we're better at it, especially organizationally. We think about it like on a Monday. We tend to be most productive and most thoughtful, but not so much by Friday when it's starting to hit 5 o'clock, right? So if we are not consistently being able to see others as individuals or ourselves as individuals in current real-time circumstances, we might need to refocus, look again, and see who they are today, right now, and at this very moment. So that's the central question of our public education campaign. Refocus, look again.
So I know we are just about at time. So we are just going to share one quick thing with you, which is education and contact. We have some supplies and some things that can help you to do that, that are great conversation starters. And you can take a look at the website, see what they are. But that idea of starting small, all the suggestions that we looked at, some of them are a little bit larger, a little bit more nuanced, but starting a conversation with someone, these are some things that you can use to, we've got lapel pins and we've got eyeglass wipes and all kinds of things that, believe me, I have handed out in so many different situations. And they have started conversations in line at the UPS store or in the veterinarian's waiting room. It's a way to help make the conversations less taboo and less difficult and get us moving in terms of contact and education.
Absolutely. And I'll tell you, as the relative new person to the Anti-Stigma Project, you know, when I first started hearing that wearing a little pair of glasses on your lapel will start conversations about behavioral health, I smiled and nodded because I thought, okay, yeah, that maybe. Every time I wear my lapel pin out, someone asks me about it. And it's a really great opportunity just to start the conversation, just to get things going.
Absolutely. And you can get it for free on the website. So take a look at that. There's articles, podcasts, we talked about sharing things, talking to people who are different than us. Share that information. We provide some information on our website. We have a whole thing on our social media. Sharing that information can really be another way for you to really start that education and contact going.
Now, I know that we are close to time here, but I do want to share in the chat very quickly a very brief link to an evaluation that's very important to us to let us know. And I just want to thank the folks in the chat who have shared some love and support already. Thank you so much to Kendra and Charlene. Really glad that you could be here today, and I'm really glad that you enjoyed the session. The evaluation lets us know totally anonymously what you thought of the session and any suggestions you have. And that could be what we're doing well, so we know to keep doing it, or something that we can improve upon, so we know that we can kind of add that or change that in the future. If any of you are interested in the Maryland Certified Peer Recovery Specialist position, if you're pursuing that certification, you can take the CEU post-test that is linked right there to earn a few CEUs towards that certification. You should be able to open up both of those things. I would recommend clicking on those links now so that they open up in your browser even after you close Zoom. If clicking on the link doesn't work, you may need to copy it and paste it into a browser. And if you would please do that. If you're not interested in the CEUs, if you are joining us from very far away, please feel free to skip the post test. But thank you all so much for being with us this afternoon, this evening. It's dark here already. But please do keep your browsers open and please fill out that evaluation. I'll share that one more time.
There we go. I was just getting ready to do the same thing. There you go. Did that come through?
Nancy, are you able to see that now? Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank
Got
you.
it? Great. Thank you all so much. And thank you for being really invested in this issue enough to be sitting here with us for the last hour and 15 minutes. We really appreciate it. Let's keep this conversation going. Thank you all so much.